This is part 4 of my Outlander Blood of My Blood Season 1 Episode 2 review. As always, if you are looking to avoid spoilers from the books or the TV show, please do keep on scrolling. So when Julia arrives at Castle Leathers, where Simon Fraser resides with his son, we learn from none other than Brian's mother, Davina Porter, what year and day she has arrived in. When I first watched the trailer and I saw this woman, I did not put 2 and 2 together that this would be Davina, but she is the housekeeper for Lord Lovett, and she is the mother of Brian Fraser, and we learn that she is the housemaid at Leathers. And essentially, Julia has been given to Simon Fraser as a form of payment by another clan, and so she is basically being held prisoner there. For Davina, she is then tasked with making her one of the staff and ensuring that she falls in line rather quickly. But Julia tries to run away. She's asking all of these interesting questions about where she is, what time it is, who the king is. And it's safe to say that Davina thinks she's a little kooky. But when Simon Fraser shows up to her quarters and introduces himself to her, we immediately pick up on the fact that she's not going to be safe with him around. And when Brian is standing in the doorway, I just about lost it because I never suspected that the first character that she would meet that we all recognize would be Brian. Because in the trailers, we see her talking to Ellen, so I would have never thought that she would have known Brian first. But this is an interesting prospect because we know that Brian and Ellen are going to get together and they run away from Castle Leoch and they hide out in a crofter's cottage for a long time. And so if Ellen and Julia one day meet, I would have to imagine that when Brian leaves, he brings her with him. Julia is very reminiscent of Claire with her defiance here. She speaks of a modern woman in a very different time, and so she's met with opposition by the men. And Simon is pretty off-put by it, and you can see here that this is basically his henchman. We haven't really learned that much about who this character is. He wasn't, I don't think, written about in any of the passages I've ever read about Simon Fraser, but you can tell that he goes everywhere Simon goes, and Brian is always left in the back. Julia is offended by the idea that she is property, and I feel like Brian can tell that even though he agrees with Julia's standing and defiance of his father, that she might put herself in harm's way if she keeps things up. Brian takes a more diplomatic approach with his father by pointing out that they should have pressed the Connors for coin instead of Julia because the coffers are low and the house is falling apart around them. And this is when we get the first bit of insight into Simon, who we know from Outlander is an absolutely terrible human being. But he essentially tells Brian that even though the house is falling apart and they're poor, he has his own particular needs to think of and prioritizes having another maidservant rather than collecting coin from people who owe him money. For Brian, I think that's the nail in the coffin that this woman is no longer safe anywhere near his father, which is only reiterated with Davina Porter. Ironically, Brian being such a person of moral character, Davina just turns a blind eye and falls in line because she's afraid of the repercussions and she's afraid of Simon. And so again, now having met both of Brian's parents and getting some sort of an idea of their character, I think it really heavily draws the conclusion that Brian is a self-made person. Henry, who has been wandering through the woods towards town, stumbles upon 2 Highlanders and he watches them exchange a bag of coins, something that gets paid off later on in the episode. And when he asks them for help and says, "Excuse me," they call him a Sassenach, and he starts to clock that that's an odd thing to say and be called. I know that there's a lot of theories about him having been a time traveler prior to this experience, and I think that there could very well be a storyline where that is the truth and potentially he travels forward and has not traveled back. But in this scene, he does seem genuinely confused. Whereas if he's traveled back to this era before, I think he wouldn't be confused by this. He also says to Julia, "What on earth has happened to us?" And so this doesn't seem like the words of someone who is familiar with what's happened to them. I think there's more to the story here. When he goes into this pub, I really loved how this shot in particular had been framed and blocked, because without even registering it, we get to see the 2 most important people that Henry interacts with in this scene. We see the backside of Malcolm Grant right next to Henry here, leaning against the bar. And then through the armpit of this man leaning against the bar, we see the blazer that Henry will eventually replace. Henry is definitely being clocked as an outsider when he walks into this bar, and when he's asked what he'll be drinking and asks for ale and doesn't have coin, he's already been, eavesdropped upon by Malcolm Grant here. And so Malcolm loans him his money and tells him that he owes him. And even when we swing to this angle of the shot, the framing is still consistent. So we have the back of this man here, but the front of the blazer, we also have a clear line of sight to Malcolm Grant and Henry. And just as Julia was able to figure out what time she's in by talking to Davina Porter, Henry is able to spot this piece of paper pinned to the wall. This oath is actually a great little tidbit of history here if you actually pause and read it. In August of 1714, King George I became the British monarch and required that all of the people in Great Britain swear an oath to him, including those at the court of St. James, which is named here on this pamphlet. That oath solidified that George would become the ruler of Great Britain and Ireland. The other interesting part of this scene is that when both Henry and Julia go back in time, they're openly using their last names. And so Henry announces that he is looking for a woman named Julia Beauchamp. And Julia introduces herself as Julia Beauchamp. Both of these things, I'm sure, are going to come up again and again and provide added context to when Claire first arrived at Leoch back in season 1 of Outlander and uses her maiden name in an attempt to try and protect her identity. But in reality, in the show, if this is how they were walking around in 1714 and around people who would remember their last name being Beauchamp, that changes everything. In this pub, we see that Malcolm Grant is in the middle of a conversation about land with another clan here, and this is our first look at Archbug as a younger version of himself. As Henry starts to overhear the conversation, he picks up on the fact that there's something shady going on with this deal, and he makes comment to Malcolm about it as he passes by him and looks to leave the pub. And that is how he ends up in a very precarious situation indeed, because he's gotten himself involved in clan matters that he had no business interjecting in. But because he said something to Malcolm, Malcolm makes sure that he follows up with him to figure out what exactly he meant by his word. Malcolm Grant is such an interesting character because he comes up time and time again in the books when he is older, alongside Archbug, so it's been really fun for me to see him playing out on screen. And as Henry starts to explain what he meant by his commentary, we can see that Archbug has a very suspicious look on his face, and the Blazer, who is clearly going to be in trouble if Henry, catches him in a lie, looks at the two of them with a little bit of concern. And so Malcolm decides that Henry is going to come with him to meet his father Isaac at their estate. Now this scene we've already talked about, and it's pretty quick, but basically this is when Julia starts to piece together what time she's in and who is on the throne at the time that she is in, and is figuring out with all these context clues that she's not in the right time. And I feel like you can see on her face that she's really, really worried because she's separated from Henry, but also from Claire. And if this is true and she has fallen back through time mysteriously, she is really kind of unsure how she's A, going to escape from Castle Leathers, but B, find Henry and also return back to her daughter. And let's not forget, she is pregnant at this point. I think because this show doesn't have the internal dialogue aspect that Outlander does with Claire's internal thoughts, we aren't really getting the true gist of just how shell-shocked both Julia and Henry probably are. It took Claire a very long time to come to grips with the fact that she wasn't imagining that she was in a different time. And I do think a weakness of this show is that we haven't really had that moment with either of these characters yet. But when we see her looking out over the edge of the castle, and this great shot here where we see her isolated in this crumbling Castle Leathers, I think it's true for her that she realizes that something has gone very wrong. Contrast that with, Henry arriving at this enormous estate that belongs to the Grant. The two of them are going through very different scenarios in this timeline. And as we see Henry approaching the house here between these two men that are about to become very significant in the scenes to follow, we start to finally piece together how it was that he showed up at Castle Leoch in the company of the Grants. Come back